Okay, greetings everyone. We continue our discussion of World War II. Okay, and this truly was a world war. I mean, not only was there a European theater, there was also a Pacific theater as well. And that largely took the form of the United States versus Japan. And we've talked briefly about Japan before. Japan, they restored the emperor to the throne in the 1850s. And that was basically the modernist party used the emperor for its own ends. And so Japan engaged in this crash course of modernization and became this national obsession. And sure, within 30 years, Japan was an industrial power. Went from being a sort of an isolated agrarian feudal society to a really sort of modern technological industrial one. And they were so advanced that they were able to defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. We've talked about this, okay? They sided with the Allies in the First World War, okay? Not that there was much fighting in the Pacific, but as the result of the First World War, Japan was entitled to some of the spoils of war. They did get some of the German colonies in the Pacific, but some of those, they didn't get all of them. Some of them went to Australia, which you could argue was itself. So, in the Japanese mind, it's nagging suspicion. No matter how good they are, they'll never be treated as equals by European power and this was further confirmed to them in the Washington Naval Treaty, which was sort of forced on them in 1922. Basically, Britain and the United States conspired to force Japan. Basically, for every 5 ships that the Americans were allowed to have in the Pacific, the British were allowed to have 5, and the Japanese were allowed to have 3. So, I mean, here's a perfect example of white people conspiring with each other. Non-white people, even though the Pacific really ought to be Japan's yard. And so, yeah, so there's suspicion that we should stop the Europeans. Now, they did, I mean, they want colonies, right? Because this is one of the things that you needed at the time if you wanted to be taken seriously as a first world country. And Japan got its hands on some German colonies. They got their hands on Taiwan. They have occupied Korea from 1910. And then they decided to, starting in 1931, they invaded China, okay? Or technically Manchuria, which is the part of China to the north of Korea. They invaded that in 1931 and they annexed it to Japan. And then, starting in 1937, they started moving into the rest of China. They occupied Beijing and they moved down the coast. Now, on the one hand, this is simply doing what the Europeans have always done. That is, well, we're going out to conquer and make colonies of places. But the Japanese they cast their effort as, oh no, we are liberating you. We are liberating the non-white peoples of the Pacific from dastardly Europeans. Okay, and so that's what they called their empire. It was the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Unfortunately, for the people who had the misfortune to be liberated by the Japanese, there was nothing prosperous about it. There was a book published within the last 15 years called The Rape of Nanking, And that, I mean, it's pretty stomach churning. I mean, Nanking was the capital of nationalist China, and it was, basically they killed about 300,000 people in Nanking over the course of 6 months, just for sport, basically. So this was, this is a big deal. The Japanese, they claim to be liberating Asia, but in fact they're just old-fashioned conquerors. And in fairness, I don't think the British ever pulled anything approaching Nanking. Not what's going on in America. America is in the Depression, right? And there's a lot of problems in America. And there's a lot of people who would like to get America involved in the world. And there's a lot of people who would like America to stay out of it. Okay? These are the two poles of American foreign policy, right? Jacksonian or Wilsonian. Okay? Or, let's engage with the world, or let's just leave the world to its own devices, because we are America, we're the new world. We don't need to concern ourselves with the problems of the rest of the world. And so there's a lot of people who would like America to get involved and make a strong stand against Japan, against the Nazis. In the Pacific, okay, there was what was called the China lobby. All right, nationalist China. Okay, when Sun Yat-sen came to power, then he was replaced by Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, nationalist China was really kind of, I guess, a lot of Westerners could go there. It was kind of open, and in particular, a lot of missionaries went to China. And I don't know if they had much success in converting people, but they certainly were sympathetic to the Chinese. Okay? And a lot of Chinese people actually came to study in America. As I say, Sun Yat-sen was in Denver when the revolution broke out. Chiang Kai-shek, his wife, actually studied at Wesleyan College in Georgia here. And so yeah, there's a lot of sympathy in America for China, and thus a lot of anti-Japanese feeling. And the China lobby, after Japan invaded China, and especially after Nanking, the China lobby prevailed upon Congress to restrict the export of scrap metal and aviation gasoline to Japan. Okay, they wanted to deprive Japan of its ability to wage war. And the same thing is going on in Europe, right? I mean, there's, if you're Jewish, if you're on the left, of course, you want to get America involved against the Nazis. If you are Anglophilic, okay, after 1939, if you have any affinity for England, you want America to get involved in the war there. But then there's a whole bunch of people in America who are like, no, these are not our problems. We should not spend blood and treasure trying to solve these people's problems. We already did that 20 years ago, and apparently that didn't solve anything. One of the names associated with this is actually named Charles Lindbergh. He was the first guy to fly solo across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis. He was part of a group called America First, and they were very keen on keeping America out of the war. But the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a bit of a difficult situation. Okay, there was something called the Lend-Lease Act, where they sort of aided Britain kind of under the table. But all of that came crashing down on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese launched a sneak attack against the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. All right? So basically, you could no longer be an isolationist after that, for obvious reasons. Okay, the war has come to America. We are at war. We declared. I mean, the trouble with Pearl Harbor is that the Japanese didn't even declare war beforehand. It was just a sneak attack. Um, they wanted to, but there were problems with the translation, and so they only delivered the declaration of war at 2 in the afternoon, long after the Secretary of State Cordell Hull had heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so that pretty much destroyed any opposition to the war. America declared war on Japan, and then Hitler declared war on America, so America declared war on Hitler. All right. And so, yeah, so America had 2 wars going on at once, one in the Pacific and one in Europe, although it is good to remember that as far as the European war is concerned, that really was Stalin's victory. All right. For every division that the Germans had in the West, they had like 19 in the East. Okay. This was their long-term project, Lebensraum, for the German people. Okay. They failed to take Moscow, so the next year, 1942, they went against Stalingrad, okay, which is a city on the Volga River to the south of Moscow. Stalin obviously named it after himself, and apparently the fact that it was named after Stalin was one of the reasons why Hitler wanted it so badly. And they threw everything they had in, and so did the Soviets. Okay, there was the Soviets had huge reserves of men. Material, well, not so much, but they could, once their industrial capacity got going, it wasn't very high quality, but they could spit out lots of it. Okay, and they just, it really was an apocalyptic struggle for the Germans against the Soviets, and it was sort of a war of attrition, and ultimately the Soviets won because they had more men and more material. So Stalingrad was saved, and after that, the movement was pretty much all in the other direction. Kursk in 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. It was a Soviet victory, and that really broke the back of the Nazi war effort. Okay, meanwhile, what's going on? Well, America has declared war on Nazi Germany in December of 1941. And for the next couple of years, they were transporting troops and equipment over to Britain. All right. So it was, Hitler couldn't invade Britain, right? Because the English Channel kind of saved him. Well, but the opposite is true. It's very, very difficult for the Allies to get all of their troops and material across the English Channel in order to invade France. Stalin kept pleading with Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt to open up a Western Front, but this was going to be, it was going to take a lot of effort. In 1942, there was a sort of the raid on Dieppe. They sent a bunch of Canadians over, and it was a complete fiasco. Okay, about a third of the people were killed, and all the rest were taken prisoner. And so they realized this is going to take a lot of effort. If we want to open up a Western Front, we are going to have to be, well, very clever about it. You're probably aware about D-Day. This was Operation Overlord. It took place on June 6th, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion of history. And there's a very famous picture of it. These troop transports would come up to the beach and open up, and the troops would wade ashore. Hitler was waiting for it, okay, but Allied intelligence, or I guess counterintelligence, was very successful at convincing him that this was not the real invasion, that this was a feint, and that the real invasion would take place somewhere else. Okay, that was the whole success of D-Day was dependent upon that. Um, the Allies were blessed with it's called Bletchley Park. Um, there's a man who worked there named Alan Turing, who's considered one of the fathers of modern computer science. They had acquired a Nazi code machine, and they had figured out a way of cracking it. All right, and so eventually they could read secret German communications in real time. Now, the trouble with intelligence, right, is you can know things, but you can't act on them. Because if you act on them, then you reveal to the enemy that you've cracked his code, and then they'll just switch their code. So there's a famous episode, The Bombing of Coventry. Allegedly, Winston Churchill knew that Coventry was going to be bombed, but they couldn't do anything about it because that would have tipped off the Germans. However, one of the great things that Ultra did is that it allowed the British to figure out who all the German spies were in Britain. And once you've figured out who a spy is, you pay him a visit and give him an offer he can't refuse. And that is, well, we can shoot you now, or you can start telling Hitler what we want you to tell him. I'm like, oh, okay. So all of these spies in Britain were busy telling Hitler, no, the real invasion will take place in Norway, or the real invasion will take place in the south of France, or in Italy, or somewhere like that. And they had constructed, actually, I seem to remember in Kent, they constructed this huge sort of Potemkin army of like fake tanks and fake invasion craft, and any airplane flying over would have been able to see it. And they're like, oh, okay, so that's the real invasion is going to come at Calais. In any event, so that kept the Nazis pinned down. Okay, it kept all the troops spread out across France. That allowed D-Day to succeed. It wasn't a treat by any means, okay? And of course, if you want to see a cinematic depiction of D-Day, have a look at Saving Private Ryan. Okay, the first 20 minutes of that is a very graphic depiction, and lots of Americans died at D-Day. And I should point out there were 3 beaches were American, 2 were British, and 1 was Canadian at D-Day. And by the time the Germans realized that it was too late. They had gotten too much of a toehold in France. And on it went. We're used to thinking of the Second World War in very positive terms because, well, we ultimately won, and the Nazis turned out to be monstrously evil. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of retroactive justification of the Second World War. But if you read primary sources about people who were there, it was a sordid mess. Okay, there was all sorts of screw ups and killing from Normandy all the way to Berlin. All sorts of, apparently the Germans were much better fighters than the Allies were. It's just that the Americans, again, had more men and more material than the Germans did. So ultimately, it was volume. As in the East, it was volume that defeated the Germans, not fighting skill. There was a brief sort of reversal that's known as the Battle of the Bulge. Also, the Battle of the Ardennes in Belgium took place between December of 1944 and January of 1945. It seemed that Hitler was attempting to separate the US and Britain from their alliance with Stalin. Okay? Because really, America and Britain, they've got stuff in common. But they don't really want their alliance with Stalin is a marriage of convenience, right? And so Hitler was basically implying you can make a separate peace with us, and then maybe we can go to war together against Stalin. What do you think? But that didn't work. I mean, the Battle of the Bulge petered out in January of 1945 when they ran out of gasoline. Okay, so at that point, it really was that was a reversal, and they kept on going all the way to Berlin. All right. Um, Now Hitler had he promised his people that they were going to come up with some miracle weapons, and the miracle weapons were going to turn the tide. All right, and I have shown there's two examples of these miracle weapons there: the V1, also known as a doodlebug, and then the V2, which was a modern rocket. Okay, so there were a bunch of Nazi scientists and technicians that work on these. The doodlebug was basically an unmanned airplane flying bomb that they'd send those up, and then it would sort of run out of gas and drop down and crash in England. You could hear them coming, and you could see them coming, and you could. I met a guy once who remembered these, and you could send a plane up and sort of tip it, and it would fly into the sea. So that was the doodlebugs weren't all that miraculous. The V2s though were they were supersonic, so you couldn't hear them coming. All of a sudden, you'd be walking down the street, and then boom, one of these things would explode. And in the closing months of the war, these V2s killed some 3,000 British people. But obviously, it did not break their will. They weren't nearly that miraculous. And so there it is. The Allies are closing in on Hitler. Russians from the east, British and Americans and Canadians from the west. And so obviously Nazi Germany is reduced to about the size of Berlin. Hitler ended up holed up in his bunker, and he committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. And of course, if you want to see a dramatization of that, there's that wonderful movie, Downfall, Untergang auf Deutsch, which has spawned any number of YouTube parodies. But I think it's a pretty good depiction of, like in the original, it's a great depiction of Hitler and his last days. All right, so with Hitler gone, the war was carried out by Admiral Dönitz, who was not, I mean, why not Speer? Why not Goering? Why not Himmler? Well, in the closing days of the war, people were abandoning Hitler like rats from a sinking ship. And so Dönitz, head of the Navy, in fact, was bequeathed the Third Reich, and obviously he, it was just 8 days later that he signed an instrument of surrender to the Soviets and the Americans and British too. Okay, so that was the Allies were pushing for an unconditional surrender, right? Because that was the problem with the last time. All right, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk obviously took Russia out of the war. So it was very important that the Allies stick together. The armistice in the West, of course, it was just an armistice. Well, it was they hadn't even invaded Germany, and so Germany could convince itself that they hadn't actually lost. All right. So the goals this time around, we're going to stick together. The alliance will hold, and we are going to hold out for an unconditional surrender. We're not going to sign any armistice with Germany. And indeed, that occurred, at a great cost, right? Even worse in the East. The Soviets, they had very little regard for human life, certainly not even for their own people. And so they had no problem sending all sorts of men to their deaths, and as long as it was to the end of defeating Nazi Germany. So there you go. VE Day, May 8th, 1945. Okay, so what about the Pacific? Well, that too was a long slog. It took a lot of effort, a lot of material, a great deal of lives. But ultimately, it was an Allied victory, and it was largely an American victory. Um, the Battle of Midway took place 6 months after Pearl Harbor. That was an American victory. It was a triumph of American intelligence, and on the day, quite a bit of luck. And so the Americans sank a number of Japanese ships, and that really kind of that marked the high water mark of Japan's conquest in the Pacific. They adopted an island hopping strategy. They wouldn't try to take back. It wouldn't be a broad front across the Pacific. They were just trying to take one island after another so that they could build up a kind of supply chain that would get them close to Japan. And, if some Japanese held islands, they would just try to isolate them. They wouldn't try to take them. All right. The trouble is that even this strategy was not easy by any means. There's a great deal of vicious fighting, a great deal of racism on both sides in the Pacific. And Iwo Jima is an island that the Americans took. We got a great picture out of it, a great propaganda picture, but at the cost of what? 4,000 Marines were killed in taking Iwo Jima. All right. And then Okinawa was even worse. That's, I think it cost 20,000 American lives to take Okinawa. And if you survived it, you very definitely had PTSD. But with Okinawa, finally, the Americans could make regular bombing runs over Japan. And American ships could move up and down the coast of Japan shelling it. The Japanese were thus reduced to sending out kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze means divine wind. And it was twice the Mongols tried to invade Japan during the Middle Ages, and twice sort of a fortuitous hurricane came up and destroyed their fleet. So that's what originally a kamikaze is. It's a divine wind that saves Japan from invasion. And so these kamikazes were going to do the same thing. Only they were just pilots, young pilots who were rushed through training school, put on a plane and loaded the plane up with bombs, and then they would fly out, look for an Allied ship, and then dive into it on a suicide mission. And there's not much you can do to defend against these. You can, you can shoot them and hope that they blow up before they hit you. But even then, you're going to have shrapnel rained down on you. All right. So so the kamikazes in the closing days of the war sunk a lot of Allied ships. Operation Olympic was the planned invasion of Japan set for November of 1945. And they reckoned they needed maybe 7 D-days worth of men for it to be successful. However, as you're no doubt aware, on August 6, 1945, and then August 9th, 1945, America exploded 2 atom bombs, one over Hiroshima, the other over Nagasaki, which led to the Japanese surrender on August 15th, and that is marked as VJ Day. Okay? And here are a couple more pictures, one of the atom bomb going up with its characteristic mushroom cloud, and the other, this is not VJ Day, this happened in September. This is the official instrument of surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, where the Japanese came to sign the instruments of surrender. So, hooray for the atom bomb, right? That is the justification that people usually give for it. right? The atom bomb ended the war, and we saved more lives than it would have cost. That was, I mean, because the trouble, the atom bomb. I mean, it was dropped. What's going on in Hiroshima? A bunch of people going about their daily lives, okay, and all of a sudden they're vaporized by this new weapon, which really was a miracle weapon. Um, so what's and so this is it's kind of like a great moral crime in some ways that we would bomb all these civilians. Same thing at Nagasaki. Okay, but the answer to that is, oh no, it ended the war. Did it end the war? This is another thing that we need to consider, and that for the past few years, um, people have been. I mean, basically, a very significant event took place between August 6, 1945, and August 9th, 1945. Okay, and that is that the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. All right, the Soviet Union had not actually been at war with Japan. Not up until that point. Stalin promised that within 3 months of the cessation of war in Europe, he would declare war against Japan. And actually true to his word, he did so on August 8th, 1945. And so with that allowed the Japanese to, that was enough incentive for the Japanese to seek an armistice with the Americans. And in fact, it allowed the Americans to actually offer a conditional surrender. Okay, we were pushing in Japan for an unconditional surrender of the same sort that we had gotten in Europe. We wanted to impress upon these people that they actually were defeated. We did not want them feeling any self-pity about we could have won if we weren't stabbed in the back. So that's why we were pushing for an unconditional surrender. The Japanese interpreted unconditional surrender, though, with the possibility that they might be deprived of their emperor. And that was politically inadmissible. You could not have that. That was unthinkable. So they were going to fight to the last man. Okay? With the Soviets, by this point in 1945, it was pretty much apparent that we were not going to be friends with the Soviet Union after the Second World War. And the Soviets invaded Manchuria, and they invaded Korea. Okay, and so we hastily kind of made a deal with Japan, which then meant that we could make a deal with the Russians. Okay, and so this is where North Korea comes from, right? They basically drew a kind of truce line in the middle of Korea. And that line is still with us, all right? North Korea had the misfortune to be liberated by the Soviets. That's where North Korea comes from. I guess Manchuria was given back to China, but not before the Soviets had completely stripped it of anything useful. More importantly, we didn't want to give the Soviets any more than that. Okay, if we had joined up with the Soviets and pushed for an unconditional surrender, it would have cost us a great deal of money and lives. But then Japan itself would have ended up divided, the way Korea did and the way that Germany and Vietnam did. So yeah, we made a deal with the Japanese, and we said, yes, you can keep your emperor. All right. So this complicates matters quite a bit, actually, because the Japanese had sort of hinted as early as April that they would be willing to surrender if they were allowed to keep their emperor. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. But we ended up giving them that deal anyway. And of course, to this day, Japan has an emperor. So that perhaps does call into question the morality of the atom bomb. I will say this, though. I mean, the atom bomb was shocking, but really, it only did with one plane and one device what had been done with hundreds of planes and thousands of devices. Okay, more people died in the firebombing of Tokyo than died at Hiroshima. Okay, I think that the atom bomb became a symbol. Okay, it allowed, in some ways, it allowed the Japanese a convenient excuse for surrendering. Oh, the our opponents have this miracle weapon that they have used against us. Um, but really, the atom bomb was not. If you just look at the damage that it did, it was on par with a serious bombing raid, like the one over Dresden or the one over Tokyo or other such bombing raids. It was not necessarily miraculous. Hydrogen bombs, of course, are another thing entirely, but they didn't have those at the time. All right. So with that, I'll finish up, and we'll talk next time about the post-war world.